Hi, everyone. This is Sam King from the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. I'm excited to be joined today by my friend and classmate, Cameron Kritikos, who graduated from the Yale School of the Environment and Schools of Divinity in 2023. So thanks so much for being with us today, Cameron.
Really happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Sam.
Absolutely. And I thought we would start our conversation today by just giving you a chance to tell your story and to share with our audience here what brought you into this field of religion and ecology and the world of faith-based environmental work.
It's a really great question. It's a big question. Yeah, so I didn't grow up in a religious family or particularly religious community, but had a conversion experience to Protestant Christianity about the age of 17 or 18. That led me to going to a faith-based Christian college, Calvin College, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I studied international development. And that was an interdisciplinary program, meaning I had an opportunity to study a lot of different topics: political science, sociology, and environmental studies. And so I started to come across the ideas and science around climate change, around mitigation and adaptation, and perhaps most importantly, climate impacts on the most vulnerable. So while I was in college, I had an opportunity to study and live in the country of Honduras down in Central America 2 separate times for a total of about 6 months. And what kept coming up while I was there was family after family who had a relative or a loved one who had to go to the United States. These were often families that were subsistence farmers, and weather patterns had changed so drastically that they weren't able to grow enough food regularly to maintain their livelihood. These were rural Hondurans who were living off of their farms, selling a bit to market, but otherwise living a relatively decent life. In the decades leading up to me visiting, and of course is still going on today, as I mentioned, weather patterns started to change. You start to see longer periods of rain or longer periods of drought that were drastically disrupting people's livelihood. And so rather than me only being familiar with scientific ideas, climate science, what have you, real people's stories were right in front of me about the impacts of climate change. And it was at that moment that what was perhaps deniable or something that can be brushed off as insignificant became very, very real. With the people who were forced to flee to the United States to make a living and then send remittances back. And so you can see all the ways that climate change is tied up in immigration and that larger conversation or lack of conversation that we're having here in the United States. And so I had that experience in college, and I worked for a few years after college, and one of those jobs was working with the Christian Reformed Church in North America, the CRCNA. It's a Protestant denomination, mostly based in Michigan, very near where I went to college. And my job was to work with congregations and individuals within those congregations on advocating for climate policy. I had gotten connected to this branch of the congregation, their outreach branch that was seeking to connect people of faith to their legislators to advocate for policy that they cared about. And the specific work that I was doing was around climate change and environmental issues. And so that work led me to organize lobbying days in the capital in Michigan, so Lansing, Michigan, and also I would travel quite often to Washington, D.C. And part of that work involved getting connected with the Sunrise Movement, which is a youth environmental organizing and advocacy movement here in the United States that's had quite a bit of success with moving the national conversation on climate issues. And so that role for me was really transformative. I also knew that that was a one-year position. Like a lot of these jobs when you first get out of college, they're either an internship or a fellowship, and this was a fellowship. And so I knew that I wanted to continue this work. It had become increasingly clear to me that climate change was one of, if not the defining issue of our time. And from my vantage point, fundamental to how we understand our place in the world as people, as communities. I believe it's abundantly clear in our religious texts, in our theological texts, that care for creation, in ecological consciousness. I know that's a word that you like to use, and it's become dear to me as well. Is central to what it means to be a steward of the planet and a member of this beloved community. And so in order to live that call out better, I had made a conscious decision to apply to graduate school. And that led me here. Yale's one of the few programs in the country that allowed me to study both divinity and environment. So I came to Yale in 2019 and spent 4 years here as a graduate student where I learned quite a bit. So yeah, that's the journey up through graduate school.
Wow, well, thank you for sharing so many formative influences along the way that led you here. I'm glad that you began with telling the story from Honduras and seeing the lived experience of climate change, especially on rural farmers, and that justice element that really animates your work and your desire to work in climate change mitigation and adaptation. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more, after all that experience with climate policy, work with your church organization, what was your experience like here at Yale? Like, what kinds of topics did you study, and how did your experience in the joint degree program at Yale really help you come into your vocation?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the word that comes to mind is disrupted. And I mean that twofold. Disrupted in the sense that 6 months into graduate school, as you know, because we entered at the same time, COVID happened. And so it's hard to separate my graduate school experience from, I think on one hand, what disrupted learning, but two, the great hurt and harm and very literal death that was happening in the world around us. And so that it was an odd experience to be in graduate school, to be committing time, energy, and resources towards learning, while so many were actively, I call it doing, in order to save their neighbors or protect their neighbors. I'm thinking about all the first responders. So there was a bit of a cognitive dissonance going on, which I'm sure was not a unique experience for myself. But I also experienced a disruption in the sense that when I started school, I strongly believed that I was going to be a bivocational pastor. I thought that I would be leading a religious community and possibly doing that part-time, and then also doing environmental work the other half of the week. That quickly changed, for a variety of reasons. I had started to experience a deep season of questioning, of call it doubt, a season of wondering and perhaps wandering that pulled me away from what at one time felt like a vocational call in order to pursue being an ordained minister. Simultaneously, while that transitioning away from one calling, it felt like another one had stepped right in. I had taken a course with Professor Karen Sito at the School of the Environment on urbanization, the phenomenon that is an urbanizing planet and all that that means for our land, our economies, what it means to be a human being, when we've organized and structured society in a way that's vastly different from what most humans have ever experienced. That course was a complete game changer for me. It had put words to a fascination and a love that I had for cities, and the degree to which they brought together people and ideas, and wild disparate land uses and interesting topography and landscapes and everything that is good and challenging about cities. And so it was at that point that my academic studies took an interesting left turn. And I really began to focus a great deal of my time on land use planning, community development, land use law, for example. And then I culminated my work with a capstone project on it was a community planning workshop working on some transit-oriented development, sort of co-locating housing and jobs and amenities around walkable neighborhoods with public transit. And I think the last thing I'll say about that is, despite experiencing a bit of transition in vocational calling, away from being an ordained minister towards wanting to work on creating cities where people can thrive and flourish, I actually still think my like underlying values have remained the same, in that I think creating and transforming flourishing neighborhoods is really at the heart of wanting to be a beloved community, as I previously mentioned. And so despite experiencing, call it a vocational change, I think my values have remained the same and maybe just gotten a little bit bigger in scope.
So cool to hear about the impact that class had on you and really resonating with your core values, and also taking you in a slightly different direction, which is something I can share with my own experience in graduate school. And I think is common to many of us who maybe come in with one intention or one area of study they want to explore, and they become somebody a little bit different, or they kindle a different adjacent passion that they then pursue on their way out. And certainly that was a very formative, 4-year journey for you?
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes felt longer than that.
I hear you, especially, during the pandemic years, no question.
Sure.
So that's a great segue, Cameron, to talk about some of your current work, because I know that you've gone on to work with Professor Karen Sito, and I'd love to hear more about that work, and then also the amazing work you're doing with the city of New Haven here in their climate task force.
Yeah, great. So I graduated, as you previously mentioned, in the spring of 2023. It was an interesting inflection and transition point in my life. I met my wife here at the Divinity School, and we got married while I was still in school. And right around the time that I graduated, she was actually then planning to start graduate school the following fall, so in the fall of 23. And so as I was thinking about what was next, what was best for my career and our family, and how we saw ourselves moving forward together, we had made a decision that I would look for a job here locally. And it just so happened that my advisor and this professor that's come up several times, Professor Karen Sito, was launching a brand new online certificate program through the School of the Environment on the topic of urban climate leadership. And so Professor Sito's research is primarily on urbanization and cities and climate change. And so with an understanding that cities and urban areas contribute roughly 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions, there's this inflection point wherein cities are often call them the problem, but they also have the greatest tools to be the solution, in that they have the greatest power for climate and emissions reduction and ultimately and hopefully adaptation for vulnerable communities that live in cities. And so this certificate was on the precipice of being launched. And so I took a job here with the Yale School of the Environment to manage that certificate. And so I spent the first year of that role building the program. So building the curriculum from scratch, along with some excellent faculty here at the School of the Environment. Just want to shout out Colleen Murphy-Dunning and Mark Ashton, Asha Ghosh, who is a lecturer at the School of Management, as well as Karen Sito. And so we built out this really exciting curriculum that covered everything from transportation, urban form, energy systems, policy, finance, climate communication, coalition building, a broad array of, call them hard and soft skills that an urban climate leader might need. And the really exciting thing about this program is it's really global in scope. And what I mean by that is when we onboarded our first cohort this year, we had 14 different countries represented. And so the exciting thing that I get to witness every week is folks learning from each other across different continents, people who work in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors who are working diligently every day to plant trees and decarbonize transportation and get climate policy and all these sorts of really exciting things. They're working to get them done in their cities and in their countries, and we get to have those conversations on a regular basis. So that's the work that I've been doing here at the school, is getting that certificate launched alongside several other new online certificates, as the school has made an intentional decision to put time, energy, and resources towards expanding our educational offerings beyond just those in-person offerings. And so it feels like an exciting time for the school in particular, because the reach is growing so much to a much more expansive global audience. And so when I'm not doing that, I am involved in a couple of projects here in the city of New Haven and in the state of Connecticut at large. I'll talk about both, but the first one, this past summer, I was asked by the mayor of New Haven to serve on the city's climate emergency task force. This is a body of volunteers based out of the mayor's office who've been tasked with using just a small percentage of the city budget, in order to advance some of the city's climate goals. And so this task force takes on a variety of roles, including making policy recommendations, working on grant writing, assisting and aiding other agencies at the city, and generally supporting all of the mitigation and adaptation efforts that happen here in the city of New Haven. It's a big job. Everybody's also doing climate and environmental work in their daytime job, and so there's a degree to which everybody is quite regularly at capacity. But it's exciting work. Of course, that work is going to be made increasingly difficult given some of the anti-climate, anti-science agendas coming from the federal administration that we're experiencing right now. And yet there's hope that we can still take advantage of statewide opportunities, philanthropic opportunities for funding in order to, to fund programs and the kinds of infrastructure investments that we need for a climate changing future, especially given our proximity to the coastline here in New Haven. So there's that exciting work going on. I'm in a bit of a smaller role that I have is with an organization called Build Green CT. It is the collaboration of several organizations. Previously, one of the largest organizations was the Connecticut Green Building Council. So you might be familiar with the US Green Building Council, and each state has their own chapter. Connecticut's chapter, as well as a couple other organizations, merged in order to pool resources. It was a really smart decision in my mind, and now it's called Build Green CT. A lot of really exciting work happens through them, and I volunteer with their advocacy community. So you may know that the legislative session just kicked off here in the state of Connecticut as of February 2024, and we've been working on writing a few fact sheets for some energy efficient home labeling bills, and several other bills that we think would be really beneficial, that will, ultimately save the taxpayer dollars, and really benefit those who have high burden utility bills. The funny thing about this work is it's a lot of Zoom meetings and a lot of Google Docs. And we've talked about this at length about the administrative nature of doing this important work, and I oftentimes find myself needing to come back to my center. Why am I doing this work? Why am I jumping on a Google Doc at 6 or 7 at night after I was doing that all day with my full-time job? But I'm reminded that as is the case with climate, what climate science tells us, that every 10th or 100th of a degree of warming means more potential harm for people. Every 10th or 100th a degree of warming that doesn't happen protects lives and protects people and habitats and ecosystems. And so it's hard not to keep that in mind when I'm feeling tired or worn. And it's not to say like you or I should wear ourselves out thin to be some kind of martyr. Absolutely not. But it is a reminder that there are good, valuable uses of my time, my energy, and my resources that, though may seem quite boring on the surface, hopefully are reflected as acts of love for neighbor.
So beautifully said, and I'm just amazed at how many different threads you're able to connect between your ethical and theological foundations and your deep interest in whether it's energy efficiency or renewable energy, clean transportation, coastal resilience, being in a low-lying floodplain here in New Haven, and how do we prepare for sea level rise as a community. I know you've been involved with urban resources initiative and planting trees throughout New Haven, and it's just really amazing to see how you've taken the kind of big picture perspective that faith and spirituality gives us and really incarnate that in place here in New Haven, in the state of Connecticut. And as we come to a close here, Cameron, kind of looking ahead, and you mentioned so much about your passion to create flourishing urban environments where well-being is enhanced by the kind of collective spaces of our cities. Where do you see yourself going with this work, and what kind of support do you need to really help to bring this amazing work out into the world? You know, you mentioned some of the challenges, the grave challenges we're facing from the federal administration. And where do you find hope? Where do you see possibilities emerging?
Yeah, good set of questions there. If it's all right, I'd love to just take a step back for a moment.
Sure.
Oddly, I'm going to return this to one of the first things that I said. Having not grown up in a particularly religious or spiritual community whatsoever, when I first went to college, I was able to go to college because I received a scholarship program through my school called the Perkins Fellows. And so it was named after a civil rights icon, John M. Perkins, who I encourage you and others, anyone watching, to Google John Perkins. He was a remarkable man who, as I mentioned, was a civil rights icon and really a leader in the Black church down in Mississippi. All of that is to say, having first been introduced to Christianity and to spirituality at that time, the idea of divorcing action and love of neighbor from intellectual idea and spirituality was a completely foreign concept to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for better or for worse, I didn't feel like I had the baggage of feeling as though I had to experience a dichotomy between belief and action, that to be a person of faith, to live into deep and rich spirituality, and like communion with the divine, was to love neighbor. And that wasn't to say that one should divorce action from contemplation and prayer, but that all of these actions, and contemplation and prayer and serving and what have you, were part of a rich spiritual life. So I felt like I just wanted to mention that because I feel like that is that's a deep part of my story, that the faith that I was introduced to when I was first welcomed into the community, very much so emphasized that this is the way, like this is how we be in the world. We love our neighbor. We speak out against injustice, because to not do so or to do otherwise was absent of a call it the public morality or public good or whatever, don't have all the right words at the moment, but I think you get what I'm sort of pointing at. It was to do public theology, if you will. So where are things headed? I'm not sure. I must admit that I did find myself coming across a publication the other day. The esteemed and renowned climate scientist Dr. James Hansen and some colleagues published a report last week, and what he was claiming based on the science was that securing a 2-degree future was already beyond reach. There's been a little bit of pushback against that, but what I find perhaps the more important point being is that conversation has started. That conversation being, what does it mean to be a conscious and moral actor amidst climate catastrophe? I think it's a question we've talked about before at length, as well as with many of our colleagues. I, at the very least, turn back to my reminder that each 10th or 100th of a degree of warming that is prevented means lives saved. And that can't be disregarded as insignificant. I also need to be reminded that at a moment when we have lost the full weight and power of the US federal government driving climate change action, that that doesn't mean that that's happened in other countries. And it's often, if not always, been the action from other nations that's driven this conversation, especially at COP meetings, especially when IPCC reports have been written. And I have full confidence that that will continue to happen. I can't tell you the number of times I have watched speakers from small nations speak at a COP meeting with such profound moral clarity, leaving me thinking, goodness, I wish we had someone like that here who spoke with such conviction. I hope that those voices are rising up. You know, you and I have talked about young people in this country who've been a voice for moral clarity on this issue. Unfortunately, that hasn't always translated into political power to make the kind of decisions that reflect institutional change. I think one of the things that I'm perhaps a little bit hopeful for at the moment is that I think some of the significant financial investments that the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Science Act and the infrastructure bill made during the previous administration were a bit of a lightning rod for industry to begin to transition. And we've already started to see that with battery plants and solar plants and EVs and things like that. I'm by no means sort of a techno optimist, but it is also no secret, and it would be foolish to think that industry didn't have a role to play. They absolutely do. So my hope is that rather than business seeing this as an opportunity to negate some of the promises that they made and the infrastructure investments that they made in the last several years, my hope is that they wouldn't turn back on those. That they'd probably tell you that's bad for business, and I hope that that's good news for us reducing our collective emissions. I imagine that we'll continue to be strengthened and poked and prodded by like the moral conviction of our religious leaders in this country. I'm sure it's any day now before Pope Francis speaks to the foolishness of climate science. It seems as though he is poking and prodding our hearts every once in a while, and I hope that my Catholic brothers and sisters and siblings are listening, as well as Protestants and all others. But I don't know, it's a tough time. I'm also not someone who desires false hope. I think we've got some dark days ahead, admittedly. If the science suggested that we were making drastic progress, we'd probably be having a different conversation. And unfortunately, we're not. It's been a little too slow. But I'm also, I maintain a semblance of hope because opting out or refusing to be hopeful would be a sort of death, a death of despair that I'm not sure our planet and its people can afford. And so perhaps one needs to maintain a degree of childlike foolishness in order to keep on keeping on and to keep doing the good work. I think of our dear, nearly 80-year-old friend, Dave Hoke, doing the Lord's work down in Birmingham, Alabama, and his capacity to remain optimistic that that we're going to find a way. I don't know. Funny thing about me, what I love to do in my free time is I read these 600, 700 page biographies of people in history, and I just finished up a book by Lincoln, and in his second inaugural address, he always talked about finding our better angels. That was really central to his vision of America becoming the place that it could be. And I've been thinking about that idea in the context of climate change, not necessarily as like a nation building project, but a place that could find its way on these questions, and that's my hope. Maybe not necessarily that we do so as a nation, but we do so as a planet, that we might discover and pursue the best version of ourselves, a world that's a little kinder, a world that's a little bit better to live in for everybody, not just a select few. So that's what I'm hopeful for today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for leaving us with that, really profound and nuanced understanding of hope, right? Not blind to the challenges, the suffering we face, but hope against hope, a kind of radical hope, because that is what our planet and all the living beings on our earth deserve. So may your work continue to flourish. Thank you for inspiring all of us with your story today. And I hope all of you can check out some of the amazing resources and initiatives that Cameron is pursuing here in New Haven and city of Connecticut and more widely. So thanks you. All the best, Cameron.
Appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.